I had to work hard to pull together all the material on this intriguing subject and to structure all the arguments for and against. I hope that you will appreciate this little investigation. Before I start, I want to tell you about my new channel Visioner Interesting, in which I talk about interesting facts and events. I put the link to the channel in the video description, as well as in the top right corner. So, let's continue. Strange as it may seem, the first doubts about the reality of the mission to the moon appeared as early as 1969, just a few months after the legendary moon landing. The New York Times published a note saying that, according to a NASA informant, all the photo and video footage was nothing more than an elaborate montage, and the skyscraper itself was shot on Earth. After this note, dozens of articles and books on the subject were published in the U.S. for many years. The possible hoax was called a lunar conspiracy. Naturally, the skeptics dismissed the fact that after the success of the Soviet Union in the exploration of outer space, the U.S., at all costs, needed to rub the nose of its principal rivals. Well, the new interest in the possible falsification of the mission to the moon arose after the interview of legendary director Stanley Kubrick's widow in the movie The Dark Side of the Moon. In that interview, the widow allegedly stated that her husband had been asked to film a fake mission after the success of his film A Space Odyssey. But as it turned out later, this interview was nothing more than a staged hoax, or rather a skillful remounting of the real interview with Kubrick's widow. But even with Kubrick it is not that simple, but I will tell you more about that later in this video. I have tried to collect for you all the existing arguments in favor of falsifying the mission to the moon, but I will also present the counter-arguments of scientists and NASA specialists. Perhaps the most popular proof of the lunar conspiracy, the first is, of course, the waving flag that American astronauts placed on the surface of the moon. As we know, there is no atmosphere on the moon, and if there is no atmosphere, there can be no wind on the moon. However, the official video footage clearly shows that the flag cloth moves as if under the influence of the wind. Experts explain this phenomenon by the fact that during the design or creation of the flag a rigid reinforced mesh was used, which turned out to be quite elastic. After installing the flag, the cover was removed from it, the canvas was unfolded and the elastic reinforced mesh began to deform under the conditions of weak gravity and oscillations. For a long time it did not disappear. Hence the effect of the flag waving in the wind. Moving on. Enthusiasts argue that since the sun is far away from the moon, the light from the star must lead to the formation of parallel shadows cast by objects on the satellite's surface. However, the shadows from objects in photos of the Apollo 11 mission are not always parallel, so skeptics argue that these shadows are not from the sun, but from a spotlight or other artificial light source. Scientists explain that the unraveling of the non-parallel shadows lies in the peculiarities of perspective. This can be illustrated by the example of two cylinders of equal height, one of which stands on a plane tilted slightly down from the light source and the other on a plane tilted up. When viewed from above, the shadow of the second cylinder will be shorter than that of the first. In addition, no photographic film captures a jump of 1 meter in height or even 1.5 meters in length, even though the free fall acceleration on the moon is about 6 times less than on Earth. In addition, there is no atmosphere on the moon. Even in heavy equipment, astronauts could theoretically jump higher than 2 meters and further than 4 meters, but experts explain such poor maneuverability not only by a heavy spacesuit, but also by the features of the suits, which do not allow astronauts to make fast enough movements for such high jumps. And it is worth remembering that with such a jump the landing could have been unpredictable, and it makes sense that the astronauts did not want, for example, to fall upside down on the top of the spacesuit and damage its airtightness. Another interesting oddity is the astronauts' shoe marks in the photos. They turned out too clear and deep because there is no water on the moon, and dehydrated soil can't keep its shape. But this phenomenon was explained, in particular, by Soviet scientists when they examined the lunar soil. It turned out that the soil of the lunar seas has an unusual property of anomalous adhesion. Thanks to this anomalous adhesion, the footprints of astronauts were clearly imprinted on the lunar surface. And the next argument about the absence of stars in the sky, which, according to skeptics, was difficult to portray in the pavilion and whose absence proves that the photographs are nothing more than a fake. Experts explain this effect by the fact that each camera has its own sensitivity threshold. There are no cameras that can simultaneously capture the bright surface of the moon and the stars, which are dim in comparison. If you remove the surface of the moon, the stars will not be visible, and if you remove the stars, the surface of the moon will look like a single white spot. Now let's move on to the oddities, which are more difficult to explain. Skeptics argue that the astronauts could not physically survive the flight. The fact is that at a distance of 800 kilometers from Earth is the Van Allen radiation belt, that is, a certain zone of intense radiation with a thickness of 1,000 kilometers, which were discovered in 1958, that is, before the flight. This belt was well known, and anyone caught in the radiation field would have received a lethal dose of radiation that would have killed them in a matter of hours. For this reason, even today, all manned flights are no further than 500 kilometers from the Earth's surface, but scientists have stated that flying through the radiation belts is not dangerous if the ship has adequate radiation protection. During the flight through the Van Allen belts, the crew was inside the command module, the walls of which were thick enough to provide the necessary level of protection. In addition, the flight through the belts was fast enough, and the trajectory was chosen so that it passed in the zone of the least radiation, but skeptics asked a logical question. Even if the Van Allen belts flew in a lunar module, how would ordinary rubberized spacesuits protect astronauts from radiation from solar flares on the moon itself? And here is the answer. American spacesuits of the time had 25 layers of different materials to protect astronauts. Such a suit weighed about 80 kilograms on Earth and 13th on the moon and was quite capable of protecting an astronaut from the strong differences in temperature, solar radiation, and radiation within reasonable limits. As for solar flares with huge radiation releases, this was indeed a dangerous phenomenon. NASA kept careful observations of the sun and were engaged in predictions of solar flares and drills. Of course, astronauts had their share of risk in this regard. Suddenly the NASA forecast was wrong, but the degree of that risk according to the experts was very small. Next. As far as is known, the temperatures on the lunar surface vary greatly, in the range of 200 degrees, and a question arose, how, when shooting in such conditions, the film did not melt. For this purpose, the place of the landing pad of the lunar module was chosen so that after sunrise not much time had passed and the surface was not heated. Moreover, the film was made on a special heat-resistant base, softening only at 90 degrees, and the cameras were covered with a reflective layer, which diverted the main heat. Moving on. The jet blast from the nozzle of the spacecraft descending to the moon was supposed to sweep away all the dust from the surface in a radius of at least 100 meters under low gravity. However, the U.S. images show the newly arrived astronaut cheerfully jumping from the moon lander into the untouched dust and stomping under the nozzle, leaving his historic footprints everywhere. To this, NASA experts responded that the lunar module approached the lunar surface on an inclined trajectory with the engine off the last 10 to 20 meters before landing. Therefore, there should be no traces of engine work under it after the final landing, and the dust settles very quickly in a vacuum. Therefore, there is no such effect of swirling dust when walking on the moon as we see on Earth, and as it turned out, some NASA specialists were engaged in comic hoaxes in the wake of the lunar conspiracy theory. Look at this photo. You can clearly see two more of his colleagues reflected in the glass of the astronaut's helmet. But of course this can't be true. There have never been more than 2 astronauts on the surface of the moon. One always stayed in the command module in orbit. The explanation was that NASA photographer David Harland just made a joke and combined the 2 photos. A very interesting theory about the flight to the moon was expressed by the legendary Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov. Leonov, on the one hand, does not doubt that the Americans landed on the moon, but on the other hand, he said that in order for the viewer to see the flight and landing on the movie screen from beginning to end as a single film, NASA specialists resorted to filming the necessary scenes, and they were filmed by the same Stanley Kubrick. For example, it was impossible to film Neil Armstrong actually opening the hatch to the moon. For the same reason, it was impossible to film Armstrong's descent to the moon down the ramp from the ship. These moments were indeed filmed by Kubrick in Hollywood studios, the cosmonaut claims, hence, according to Leonov, the gossip that the moon landing was actually filmed entirely on Earth. This theory does explain many strange facts. Let's go back to the official chronicle. Note the following photograph. Here the American astronauts are heading toward the lunar module. Notice the two labels on each of their chests on the left and right and the white color of their spacesuit hoses. Here the astronauts are approaching the car that will take them to the launch pad, and you can see the label on this car as well. Then there are shots of the passengers getting out of the truck, but where is the label on the car, and why has the hose of the departing astronaut gone black, and where has the second label on the spacesuit disappeared? None of the astronauts have a second label. Let's keep looking. Here the astronauts take their seats. I never noticed a second label on the spacesuit. But you will logically notice that the first scene could well have been a photo shoot for the press and was just filmed with other spacesuits. All the more interesting is what happens next. And so the astronauts flew to the moon, and what we see is that there are exactly two labels on the spacesuits again, and the only logical explanation for all this is that we are shown slices from different takes taken at different times. Such oddities are explained by Alexei Leonov's theories. And one more interesting detail. In preparation for the 40th anniversary of the lunar landing, we suddenly discovered that the original footage of the cosmonauts' landing was missing. How could such valuable artifacts just disappear? So that the public wouldn't worry too much about the missing films, we were told that the originals were most likely already unusable anyway because they had deteriorated from long storage, or maybe they didn't want these films to become material for independent research. Who knows? It is quite possible that I have not given all the arguments of the skeptics here. In any case, I have tried to break down the most famous evidence of the lunar conspiracy, and who was more convincing in this argument is for you to decide. But I am inclined to agree with the opinion of cosmonaut Leonov. In my opinion, the Americans did go to the moon, but many episodes of this expedition were filmed afterwards, which caused rumors and some inconsistencies. What do you think about it? Be sure to write your opinion and give it a thumbs up. And of course, sign up. There is a lot of interesting material ahead of you.